Get him on stage, Al. Poor Jackie. He's been abused today. Not going to say by who, but I'm probably standing right here. So it is great to see everybody tonight. If you got your Bibles, turn with us to Judges chapter 8. Judges chapter 8. We're continuing walking through this Old Testament book here. Last week we looked at the second part of Gideon's story, and we continue talking about Gideon and some of the things that he had done there in Judges chapter 8. So y'all flip over there and we'll get started with that. Just kind of refresh. God had, last week when we looked at it, God had dwindled the 32,000 men down to 300 men and told them, hey, that's who you're going to fight with. You're taking this group of guys, you're going to fight with these 300, you're going to defeat the Midianites, and we'll actually see the number of people that they defeat in this chapter. Over 130,000, I think it's 135,000 is how many they defeat as the entirety of the battle goes on. They'll finish that battle up today. But he had the 300. They went. They did exactly what God wanted them to do. God gave them the victory. And then we see him bring in the other tribes, especially the tribe of Ephraim there on the back end, where he invited them in to cut off the people from crossing the Jordan River. And they actually captured two of the leaders of the Midianites. And so we see that happening in this moment where chapter 8 is kind of a continuation there. So they just captured those leaders, they beheaded them, brought those heads back to Gideon, and then we pick up that interaction starting in verse 1. So let's look at Judges chapter 8, starting in verse 1. It says, Then the men of Ephraim said to him, What is this thing you have done to us, not calling us when you went to fight against Midian? And they contended with him vigorously. These guys are upset. They're looking and going, why didn't you call us? Kind of strange here in chapter 8, because you're going to see some other ones that are looking and going, hey, kind of leave us alone. We don't want to be a part of anything that you're doing. That was not the idea of everybody. It leads to a disunified nation is really what we're looking at as you look into it, and you're like, okay, it kind of makes sense seeing different people's reactions. But the tribe of Ephraim says, why didn't you invite us in the beginning? Obviously, the number of people were dwindled down from 32,000 to 300. So there was no real reason to invite them because God would have sent them home anyways. But that was their response. They said, hey, you didn't tell us until after the battle had started. We wanted to support you and be a part of that. And so there's an argument going on there. Verse 2, it says, But he said to them, What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has given the leaders of Midian, Oreb and Zeb, into your hands, and what was I able to do in comparison with you? Then the anger toward him subsided when he said that. You see a very diplomatic stance from Gideon. He looks and says, but guys, what have I done compared to what you've done? Y'all captured the two leaders. How many leaders did I capture? How many leaders did I kill of the Midianites? He's looking at him and saying, hey, what have I done in comparison to what y'all have done? So he takes a very diplomatic stance in this moment. As you read through the chapter, you may think it's genuine, you may not. But nonetheless, he does calm the anger of that group. They look and go, okay, we see, yes, we were a part of the battle. We were able to make it through all of this. And so we're okay with that. So his answer satisfied the people there, the tribe of Ephraim. They were praised for their victory over the two leaders, and so they're happy with it. They were happy with that answer from Gideon. And so it continues on, and this is kind of where we start to see a little bit more of Gideon's mindset as we get into verse 4. So he has that conversation with the tribe of Ephraim. And then they continue on their journey. Look at what verse 4 says. It says, Then Gideon and the 300 men who were with him came to the Jordan and crossed over, weary, yet pursuing. So this tells us that the battle is not over yet. Yes, those two leaders were captured in the last chapter. He took time to praise the tribe of Ephraim for their help in cutting the people off from crossing the Jordan there. But they had apparently not captured all the people yet, because Gideon and the 300 are still pursuing other people. Now, if you think about it, we do know that the number that Scripture tells us is about 135,000 people. 120 of those have already been killed. If we look back at the battle that we talked about last week, we described the fact that the chaos of the 300 men in the middle of the night while people were asleep led them to some of them killing themselves. But Gideon and the 300 men still had to fight in that. They still pursued people. They're still fighting. And so at this point in time, they're chasing down the rest of the men, which is 15,000 of them, and the two leaders that are left. They're chasing them down, and they're tired. They're exhausted. They've had a full day's worth of war. It's 300 versus 120,000 at this point that they've already faced. So they're exhausted. Even if half of those people killed each other, and it's one of those you're looking and going, well, they only killed 60,000. There's still only 300 of them. And so you can imagine that they're exhausted. We know our attitudes change when we're tired. And so you can give Gideon maybe a little bit of grace as he walks through this, but they're tired. But they're still pursuing because the battle's not over. The battle is not over yet. And pick it up in verse 5. It says, he said to the men of Succoth, so they've made it to this town here of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who are following me, for they are weary, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. The leaders of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hands that we should give bread to your army? I looked at this and I'm like, why? My first question that came is, why did they refuse to give bread until the kings were captured? So since that was the first question that I had, I'm going to ask y'all that question too. Why would they have refused bread to Gideon and the 300 in this moment? They said, hey, we need something to eat. We're tired. We're exhausted. We're still chasing after people, trying to get rid of this. But most likely they've probably already heard or seen the slaughter that's already happened. Why would the people of Succoth say, do you have those kings captured yet? Any thoughts? They were scared? Where do we find Gideon when his story starts in Judges chapter 6?
He had shifted wheat.
Threshing wheat in the winepress. Why was he hiding? What was being taken from them? The stuff they needed to make bread. So when you look at this and the people are coming through town, they said, do you have all the leaders yet? Because if you haven't captured all the leaders, you're not getting our bread. Because we've gone 7 years of scrounging around the best we can just to get bread in our homes. And so the people of this town are looking and going, until the Midianites are done, we're not giving anything because we need this for us. We need this for our survival. We need this for our people. And so at first I'd wondered, I was like, why would they do this? But then you get into the history of what they're doing, where they've been, what they have been facing over the past 7 years. It makes perfect sense that they would look and go, hey, until that battle's over, you're not getting any of our bread because we want to make sure that we're eating. We want to make sure that we've got something to last us. And so, yeah, maybe you're facing and going and chasing after the last 15,000. There's only 300 of you, and we're not betting on that right now. We're going to make sure that we've got something to eat tonight, no matter what happens with you. And so we see that reaction from the town or the people of Succoth, but you also see that in verse 7. And Gideon does this in verse 8. We'll get to the next town. But Gideon says this in verse 7. All right, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna, those two leaders, into my hand, then I will thrash your bodies with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Gideon said, fine. You don't want to give me bread? I'm going to come back and whip y'all with some briars when this is all done. Little extreme, little bit rough there. That's why I said you're giving Gideon a little bit of grace because they're tired, they're exhausted. They just asked for some bread for the men, and they were told no. So maybe we give them a little bit of grace, but in my mind, it's still an extreme response to them saying, "Hey, no," because Gideon knew that past. Gideon had lived in fear because that's where the angel of the Lord found him in chapter 6. Found him afraid in the winepress, threshing wheat because he wasn't sure where he would be able to provide for his family if he didn't hide and do it in secret. And so Gideon knows what these people are going through, but he's still very, very frustrated with what it is with what it is that's happening. And the thing is, he goes into verse 8, and he went up from there to Peniel and spoke similarly to them. And the men of Peniel answered him, just as the men of Succoth had answered. So he spoke also to the men of Peniel, saying, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. He went to 2 different towns and got the exact same response of, hey, if you don't have the leaders already captured, we're not giving you any bread because we've got to take care of ourselves. And in both places, Gideon gives them a response and says, all right, when I capture these kings, this is what I'm going to do to your people. The first one is I'm going to whip your leadership. I mean, we're going to treat you as an enemy of the state. Is essentially what he's saying here is we're going to come back and we're going to the wilderness. We're going to get these briars and the thorns of the wilderness with the briars, and we're going to punish your leadership with that. And then he looks at the next town and says, I'm going to tear down this tower. I'm going to destroy part of your town because you are not giving us any kind of bread. Why do you think Gideon would respond that way? Is there anything that you can think of that would merit that type of response?
He's been fighting all day to protect those same people that wouldn't give him no bread.
Yeah.
That would make me pretty perturbed.
And they wouldn't give it up because the job wasn't complete.
Yeah.
Until
They're
they.
kind of
They were
caught
not
between a
getting
rock
what
and
they
a hard
were,
spot.
they were not getting what they were paid for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The way they could figured it.
Yeah.
Following God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was aggravated and people weren't trusting what God had told them to do.
Yeah. Because Gideon he's doing exactly what God asked him to with the amount of people God asked him to. And Gideon's just trying to follow what God asked. And there's frustration in this. Now, we don't see a mention of God in this moment. Probably a problem with that. But we don't see a mention of God till you get down to verse 19, honestly. And it's still not in a great light because of the frustration of Gideon here. But you could be very well the thing of, I've responded to what God's asked me to do, and I'm just asking y'all to help us out in this journey, and you're not doing that, but we're following God. And so you're not helping us along. You're not being team players in all of this. He had just talked to the tribe of Ephraim, and they're like, why didn't you tell us? Because we wanted to go fight with you. Now he walks to this town, which are Israelite towns, and he walks into those towns with the men, and he said, I just need some bread. I'm not asking you to go fight. I'm not asking you to do anything. We just want some bread to give us some kind of sustenance so we can continue the fight. And they're looking and going, not till the job's done. When you finish the job, then we'll talk about it. Gideon's frustrated. And honestly, I get it. I understand that he's following God's plan. A majority of the battle has already been won. And so you look and go, well, where would your faith be? Why don't you put some faith in this? Yes, we know what the past is. Yes, we know there's been 7 years of extreme oppression where they've come and destroyed our crops. But why don't you just have faith by looking at what has already been done, trusting that the job will be completed by God?
You know, I wonder if God kind of got frustrated with Gideon because look at what God had to go through with Gideon to get Gideon where he was at. And
Yeah.
now the tide's turned, and here's
Yeah.
Gideon with them, you know.
But what was God's response to Gideon when he asked multiple times, hey, give me a sign, give me a sign?
He gave it affirmation.
God showed patience. Gideon showed frustration because he wasn't being fed. He showed frustration in this. There's a lot of different ways you can take this. I'll be honest with you. I don't know that there's a clear-cut answer to that question of why he would respond in this way. But I do believe as you walk through this chapter, you begin to see that some of the things that Gideon does is very personal in this chapter. And so I think Gideon took their response personally. I think it looked at that, and it wasn't that they were saying, no, we'll honor when God gives the victory. It's one of those of, no, he's saying, you're not willing to feed us because you don't trust in what we're telling you. You're not trusting in the entire vision of all this. And so he took it personally. Whether or not that was their meaning behind it or not, that's where Gideon is at in my belief as you look into this point, because the things that Gideon continues to do from this point on has a very personal twist to it. And he becomes frustrated with this little hiccup in the middle of the road that he has. They just said, hey, we're not providing any bread there. I don't know how much bread they had. I don't know if they had 7 barns out back that were all full of grain and they're just overloaded with it. And they're looking and going, hey, we'd rather that stuff rot than give it to you. I don't think that was the case with any of this. So we don't know how much they had. We just know that Gideon's response was what it was most likely because of some frustration that's going on as he's pursuing these people here. So, again, he showed great diplomacy with the tribe of Ephraim. When he talked with them in the first few verses, it was, hey guys, y'all were a part of the battle. I didn't invite you on the front end, but guess what? You were still a part of that victory. You killed 2 of the leaders already. I've not killed any. And so there's great diplomacy there. But now in the midst of this town, he doesn't take that high road like he did with Ephraim. He looks and goes, I can't believe that y'all aren't giving us bread. So when we finish this task, we're coming back and we're going to have words about what happened here. But we've got to continue to pursue them. 2 totally different mindsets from Gideon here, but in both of them, he's just as tired. There was no more fighting that had gone on. There was some pursuit, but they're just as tired in the first conversation as he was with the 2 towns when he met with them. But one of them was looking and saying, hey, this is what we want to do. We wanted to be a part of this journey. We wanted to be a part of this battle. We wanted you to include us, where another group is saying, we don't want to be included right now because we're struggling to survive on our own. So how about you leave us out of it until you've completed this, because we're still fighting for our own people. We've got to do what's best for our people. And so right now we can't give you bread because it's been hard to come by. 2 totally different interactions. 2 totally different responses from Gideon. So I don't know that we can give him a ton of grace on that, but we can continue to walk through this story and see what happens after that. Verse 10 moves us in to that continued pursuit. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Kakor, and their armies with them, about 15,000 men, all who were left of the entire army of the sons of the east, for the fallen were 120,000 swordsmen. First time we see a number from that battle that we read about in chapter 7. There's 135,000 roughly of the tribes of the east that had come and that were wreaking havoc on Gideon and the Israelite nation. They were the ones that were coming and destroying these crops there in the valley. And so there's a roughly 15,000 of them left with these 2 leaders. And so that's everything. That's all of them that's left out of this whole number, because 120,000 were already defeated. So verse 11 says, Gideon went up by the way of those who lived in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and attacked the camp when the camp was unsuspecting. When Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. So again, we see the same type of tactic that he had when they pursued the army first. It was at night. There was a surprise attack. We don't know the time of day on this one, but we know that he continued that surprise attack because there's still only 300 of them. There's 300 men plus Gideon, so that's all that is there, is those 300 people. And so they're continuing the fight, and they've got to do it by surprise because there's 15,000 people. So there's still a good number that they've got to get rid of. And so they do it by a surprise attack again, and all of them are taken. The 2 kings are captured. They're not killed yet. We'll see that response here in just a few moments. But we see out of the original 135,000, there's only 15,000 left. Gideon and his men, all of them are still there. None of them have lost their life. And amazingly in this process, because God is fighting this battle, they continue to pursue, and they capture the last 2 leaders. So the only 2 out of the original group that they were tracking down are the 2 leaders that are left. Going into verse 13, it says, Then Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a youth from Succoth and questioned him. Gideon doesn't waste any time. They're on their way back. They've got the 2 leaders with them. They've not done anything with them yet. But on their way back through town, they stop there in Succoth, and he gets one of the young men, one of the youth as it's described here. And so he captures one of the youth there from Succoth and questioned him. Then the youth wrote down for him the princes of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. So the assumption here is he captured one of them and said, I need you to write down a list of every one of the leaders of your town. So he did that. The princes and the elders, 77 men. He wrote down those names. And then verse 15, he came to the men of Succoth and said, Behold, Zebah and Zalmunna. He said, I've got them in hand now. I've captured them like you asked me before. Here they are. Concerning whom you taunted me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are weary? So he went and looked and said, I got the 2 that you asked me about. I've captured them. Brought them back to town. And then he took the elders of the city in verse 16, and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. I grew up in a house that believed in discipline, and so I know what discipline is. My children know what discipline is. But there was an interesting note in one of the commentaries that I read that talked about discipline, and what it said simply was, this word here that we've translated into discipline simply means made the men to know. He made the men to know what he was displeased about, what it is that they question him about. He's like, hey, now you know that we could accomplish this task. You should have given us bread before. But basically, he takes the thorns and the briars from the wilderness, and he disciplines all 77 of these leaders. I was going to say, how many of y'all remember those switches? And what happened if you got the wrong switch? You had to go back and get the right one until you found the right one. Y'all learned how to pick those out right way, didn't you, Brother James?
And you know, my mom was, I was mom's baby. And when Daddy...
So you were the favorite too? That's what I am.
And Mama would pet me, and then finally after a while, when Daddy would whip me, I went to Mama and she whipped me too, so...
She figured out what you were doing. That baby done wore off. And she's like, no, we're not going to that. You getting the whipping too. There was not much that was worse than when Mama would say, hey, you just wait till Dad gets home. I'm like, Lord, please let her forget. She didn't forget a whole lot. My mom has a really good memory. She did growing up, and she always has. Mama didn't forget a whole lot, and there were times that Mama showed grace, and her and Daddy would have the conversation, but it had kind of passed on, and we didn't always get what we deserved. And so I'm grateful for those times that Mama didn't forget, but she allowed it to go by. There's a lot of times she didn't, because I usually deserved whatever it was that was coming my way. Thankfully, I grew up in an era where my grandfather just created a paddle for all of us, and it was written in Sharpie whose paddle it was. And so we had those hanging up, and we knew that when it was time that the paddle was coming off the nail off the wall, then we were really hurting. I learned the lesson quick. You don't hide the paddle. That's as bad as picking the wrong switch. Because that was the one time I got the belt, and I never made that mistake again. Because I still remember what that felt like. So. Nonetheless, in this moment, Gideon comes back. He's got those two leaders, and he disciplines the leadership of this town just like he said he would. He said, I told you this is what I was going to do. And I don't know if it was one of those that he had tried to convince them early on. If it just know that we're pursuing, God's going to give them into our hand. I don't know the conversation they had. We just know he asked for bread and they said no because he didn't have the leaders there. And so I don't know if this was Gideon looking and going, I told you I'm a man of my word. I told you we were going to capture them. And since I'm a man of my word, now you're getting the punishment that I already told you were going to get. We don't really know any of that. That's speculation. But I think there's still some frustration with all of this with Gideon. And so he does that in verse 16. And then in verse 17, it says he tore down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the city. Now, that wasn't a part of what he had told them. He just said, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. I don't know if that's where the men stayed or what, but nonetheless, he said, this tower is coming down when we come back. And what verse 17 tells us, he tore down the tower and he also killed the men of the city. He came back and he did exactly what he told them he was going to do. The thing that we struggle with in all of this is Gideon was very hesitant. And we've seen Gideon change primarily at the end of chapter 7 into chapter 8. Gideon has completely changed from where we met him. He was shy. He was scared because he was found hiding in the winepress, threshing wheat, not where he was supposed to be. He was timid with what the Lord was asking him to do because God told him, he said, if you'll be willing to go, he said, we can take the Midianites with just you and I. So all 135,000 could have been Gideon's if he had gone with the Lord then. He was nervous about it. He threw out the fleece. He asked for the miracle of the sacrifice to be burned up without fire there. God showed him all three of those signs that he was there. And then he still sent him and his servant in chapter 7 to listen to the camp and let them know that they're having dreams about this man named Gideon coming and overthrowing this entire army. So throughout all of this, we've seen the fear that kind of gripped Gideon in him taking what God had asked him to do. Now, he had seen the victory in this battle, but we see a completely different mindset because the Gideon that we read about in 6 and in the beginning of 7 is not the same Gideon that we see in chapter 8. God is using it.
The power of the Lord, how he changed, transformed him, and it just seemed like it just built him up. He got more courageous, and he was it. He was going to complete what he started.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of those things too for us. The more we see God, the more bold our prayers become, right? The more we see God doing things. When he answers one of those prayers, we're like, hey, you know what? God will do this. You see him work a miracle in a place that maybe you didn't expect it, and you're looking going, hey, that was God. That had to be God. We get a little bit bolder in our faith. You go through that first time of witnessing to someone, and you're like, hey, maybe they didn't respond how I wanted them to. Maybe they slammed the door in my face. Maybe I've not been able to have a conversation with that person since then. But once you go through those steps and God reminds us, hey, I'm here, I'm with you, I've not left you. You can do this because I'm going to help you walk through this process. We become bolder like Gideon did in these moments. Now, I'm not going to say that this is all righteousness from Gideon because we continue to see a different picture. But Gideon has changed nonetheless. He is not that same shy leader that God said he was going to be. It's not that same shy person that the angel of the Lord found in the winepress there. Nonetheless, he goes through all of this. He treats them as the enemy because they didn't want to participate in God's victory as they were chasing down the rest of them. So he takes care of those two cities, those men of those cities. And then he continues on in verse 18. Now that he's addressed that part that frustrated him, he turns his attention to the two kings of Midian. And then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna there in verse 18, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? He goes back and he asks him and said, what kind of men did you kill at this other place? And so Who were these people? And Gideon we're starting to understand kind of where he's going with this, why that pursuit was so important. We do know that in Scripture, they were supposed to kill them all. Israel hadn't followed that since they got into the promised land. God told them, he said, you got to get rid of all the people or they're going to turn you against me. They're going to turn you to their gods. They've not followed that format. And so there's not a belief that Gideon's looking and going, you know what? I'm going to be the one that stands up and says, I'm going to do what God had asked us to do, because they've not done that since Joshua died. They didn't even do it fully when Joshua was still alive. But they've not fulfilled what God told them through Moses that they were supposed to do and what they were reminded of when Joshua was leading them. They've not taken that stance. So we can look and go, hey, Gideon finally did it. He killed the entire enemy. This is where we find out that the belief is that it turns personal. So he said, what kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? And they said, they were like you, each one resembling the son of a king. It's almost like they're trying to flatter him a little bit. They're looking going, they had that same stature that you did, Gideon. They have that same appearance. They look like royalty like you do, like the leader that you are in this moment. And so there's almost this idea, and some commentators kind of point to that, that there's almost this idea of flattery in this moment from these two kings. But they're not denying what they did. He said that they were like you, each one resembling the son of a king. Verse 19, he said, they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you. The first time God is mentioned in chapter 8 is in the moment where Gideon actually shows that he's not trying to accomplish what God asked him to do. Because what did God tell them all the way back in Deuteronomy about when you go into this nation, when you go into this land, we're wiping every one of them out. How we know this is personal with Gideon is he looks and says, as the Lord lives, if you'd have let my brothers live, I wouldn't kill you. That goes completely, do what? He did. So that goes completely against what God had commanded the people all the way back to Moses. What they were reminded of with Joshua, what they were living through now as a people. They were told, you've got to destroy the entire enemy, because if you don't, bad things happen. And they've been witnessing that. But Gideon, showing his personal nature to the pursuit of these two men, says, as the Lord lives, the first time he mentions God in this part of the passage, as the Lord lives, if you had let my brothers live, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. If you had left them alone, I wouldn't obey what God has asked us to do. He is looking to repay what had happened to him. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, because I know that some of y'all would look and go, well, that's not the right answer. That's not the Sunday school answer. But if we're honest with ourselves, the majority of us would do the exact same thing that Gideon did in this moment. He's looking and going, the two of y'all have just admitted that you were the two leaders that killed my brothers. God's already told me that I'm supposed to go and defeat the enemy. I'm going to make sure that I take my time getting rid of you. That would be a lot of our mindsets in this. And maybe you've been through certain trials in life that lead you to that point where you're looking and going, Josh, I know that that's what I would have said in my mind, whether I acted on it or not, because I've been in that place where I wanted to destroy the enemy that took something from me. Yeah, he's already delivered the enemy into his hands. God's told him, he said, you pursue these people, you're taking this entire 135,000 people. Yes, yeah, exactly. So God's already told him, hey, you're supposed to get rid of all these people. So he's justified in this, but he takes a moment to make it personal. I think if it had happened, this chapter would have read completely different for many of us. Because on the surface, the first time I read through it, I'm looking and going, okay, I get what it is. But when you start to dig into it and you're looking going, hey, there's some personal feelings here. So now I go back and read the beginning part of Judges 8, and I'm looking and going, there's some frustration because there's some personal feelings here. This is now not just a pursuit to finish off this army. This is a pursuit to take back vengeance that I feel like I'm supposed to lay out on these people because of what they took from me. Had he just beheaded them and brought the heads back to the city, nobody would have said anything. Commentators, when they're writing about Judges chapter 8, it wouldn't have looked anything like this. It would have been one of those where it was just one of those, hey, Gideon did what he was supposed to. He came back and lived at home. The land was at rest, and things were good until Gideon died, and then the people went back and did all the things they did again. But Gideon takes a moment, and he makes it personal. And he said, they were my brothers in verse 19, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if only you had let them live, I would not kill you. That is not what God told him to do. If we'd have left out verse 19, and if whoever wrote Judges would have been like, hey, Gideon had the opportunity to repay people that had killed his brothers, and nobody would have read anything into it. But Gideon looks and says, if you let my brothers live, I'd let y'all live, even though God said don't do it. He's made it personal with these people, and we understand why, because he's struggling in these moments. In verse 20 it says, so he said to Jether, his firstborn, Matthew should be grateful that I didn't name him Jether. He said to Jether, his firstborn, rise, kill them. But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. He looked at his son, and we don't know the age of his son. We just know that he's still considered a youth. And he said, son, get up and kill them. But his response was the same as what we found from his dad. It goes back to that change in Gideon. He didn't even think that he could lead an army, yet alone kill somebody by himself. In the chapter 6 where we met him. His son has some of those same characteristics, but Gideon maybe possibly had even been hardened through this process, but there's a boldness that was not there before. And so he looks at his son. I don't know if he's trying to teach him a lesson, and he didn't want him to be timid because that's who he was. And you know, we all try to do that with our children. We try and get them to learn the lessons that we had to learn the hard way. We try to teach them the easy way, but oftentimes they've got to walk through it as well because they're just as stubborn as we are. And so he looks and says, son, get up and, he said, rise and kill them. So, but the youth didn't draw his sword, for he was afraid because he was still a youth. Then the leaders, then Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise up yourself and fall on us, for as the man, so is his strength. I said, you can't do it yourself. I don't know if they meant it as an insult, but when I read it, that's exactly how I took that. It was an insult to them and said, won't you rise up yourself and fall on us? For as the man, so is his strength. I am fairly certain that if that was treated as an insult, if it came across that way, they'd still be finding pieces. I would be frustrated to no end with this. We still don't know that they've eaten, unless they took bread from the other towns. They've been weary. He's got some frustration. This is a personal vendetta for him in this moment. And these two guys mock him in this way. And so we see what he does there. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna and took the crescent ornaments which were on their camels' necks. So he took a little bit of a trophy from them. Nothing that told us that they couldn't do that. So there was no issues with that in this moment. But he does kill both of them and takes a trophy from that. And so we continue to move on from that. Verse 22 says this, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son, also your son's son, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. What the people of Israel looked and said, we're not going to call you a king, but we're asking you to rule over us, and we're going to make a dynasty out of this. We don't know that his son had a son yet because he was still a youth, because his firstborn was just described as a youth who would not draw his sword. But the people of Israel looked at him and said, why don't you rule over us, you and your son and your son's son? We want to create a dynasty with your family because we've seen what you've done. They just came out of 7 years of extreme oppression from the Midianites. Those 135,000 people are now gone, and they look and say, why don't you rule over us? Why don't you rule over us? Look at Gideon's response. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over, because I want to go back right before we read 23 again. Look at what it says at the end. For you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. That's going to be important when we look at Gideon's response. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. If you just scratch through that one, it looks like he says, you know what? I'm giving you the right answer. You know what? God's going to rule over you. I'm not going to do it. My son's not going to do it. He didn't get the grandson because the grandson's not around yet. So he just said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. But the reason they wanted him to rule over them was what? Because he had delivered them from the Midianites. But really, who delivered them from the Midianites? God did. And so we see that Gideon appears to have the appropriate answer to this question and said, hey, we'll let them rule over you. We'll let God do this. When in reality, what he should have started with is, hey, that victory was not mine. I didn't do this. This was God. God orchestrated this. God used us. He allowed us to walk through this battle, and we defeated 135,000 people without losing a single person on our end. We are not the ones who can claim this victory. That should have been what happened there. He should have deflected who the victory came from. He still gives us that Sunday school answer of, no, we're not going to rule over you because God needs to rule over you. There wasn't a king in Israel. There's still not one. That becomes an issue at the end of the book of Judges as they kind of go through some of this. But Gideon is kind of that first part where they're starting to really itch for a king. God had given them somebody to rule over them with these deliverers that he'd given, but they're looking and going, hey, we want this to be consistent. We want your family to lead this. Gideon says no, but he still doesn't give God the credit for it all. Yet Gideon said to them, he said, I'm not going to rule over you, but I would request of you that each of you give me an earring from his spoil, for they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. They said, we will surely give them. So they spread out a garment, and every one of them threw an earring there from his spoil. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the neck bands that were on the camels' necks. So Gideon said, I will not rule over you. But if you dig into what he asked for, that was the king's ransom for his spoil for a victory in battle. It was one of those, he's like, I'm not going to rule over you, but if you want to go ahead and give me these things, that would be great. And so they do. They look, and they're willing to make him king, so they're willing to give him an earring here. So every one of them do it. There's all the spoils and stuff that come from the war. They throw this in there and see what Gideon does with all of that. So verse 27 says, Gideon made it into an ephod and placed it in his city, or Oprah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his household. Do what? Go ahead. Yes. So what he did is he took this and he made a golden ephod, and he set it up in his city, and it became an idol to the people. Now, if you have studied the book of Exodus, does anybody remember what the golden calf was made out of? Earrings. Started with earrings. Started with earrings. Now, they found other stuff because they made a really big calf out of that thing. But it started with earrings, just as Gideon's did. So he goes back to part of their history. But if you go back just a couple of chapters, you remember what Gideon had to tear down before he could go and fight the fight. He had to tear down the altar to who? To a foreign god that was Baal. And he had to tear down the pole, the Asheroth that was there, that was set up next to this. So in his hometown, outside of his father's house, there was an altar and another idol that he had to tear down before he could start this. Now he's going into battle. They've given him these spoils. He makes this golden ephod and he sets it up as an idol in his hometown. I look and I'm like, you can't make this stuff up. Like, how do you even get to that point where we started this story of God asking him to be obedient and say, hey, you got to get rid of these things. You got to focus on me. Now he looks and goes, hey, well, I'm not going to be your king. God's going to rule over you. But if you want to throw in some earrings and some extra stuff, I could make something really nice so we could remember this victory. And what we find is that the Israelites played the harlot with it. They fell in love with this thing. It became an idol to them. And it was a snare to Gideon and his household. Continuing on, verse 28 says, so Midian was subdued before the sons of Israel, and they did not lift up their heads anymore, and the land was undisturbed for 40 years in the days of Gideon. One of the sad notes about this is that is the last time that we find the land has rest in the book of Judges. It is the last time that we're told in commentary that this is the last time that they find rest for the land in the book of Judges. And so Midian is taken care of. Those rulers are there. But the thing about it is all the Midianites did, I say all, they crushed their crops. What Gideon did as a ruler is he brought in an idol for them to worship in the disguise of following God. He brought in an idol for them to worship, and he placed it in his hometown. I read through some commentaries that said they would have been better off if they had just lived under the oppression of the Midianites and called on the Lord like they had done all those other times. Because now there's this disguise that God's man has brought us something to worship besides God. And so he led them down a path that was even worse than what the Midianites were doing to them. Continues on, then Jerubbaal, that's Gideon. Remember his name change from his father. That means let Baal contend. Let Baal answer for this. He will. The son of Joash went and lived in his own house. He went back home. He went back home to where he was when God had found him. Now Gideon had 70 sons. No. Just no. Who were his direct descendants. He didn't adopt a bunch of people. He wasn't running an orphanage. They were his direct descendants, for he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Abimelech will become popular in the next chapter as we talk about him. But what we see here from Gideon, and it says, and Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a ripe old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abizrites. So what we see here is the people try to make him king. He doesn't really assume that role, but he's still kind of leading the people. They're still following him. Not only does he set up an idol, but he does something that God told kings not to do in Deuteronomy 17:17. It says, he shall not multiply wives for himself, or his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. God had told the kings, the people who were leading people, said that that's something that you're not supposed to do as a leader, is don't take multiple wives because your heart will be turned away from me. Not only did he take multiple wives and have 70 sons, one of them was from a foreign nation. The one who gave him Abimelech was from a foreign nation. And so that's going to be a whole issue down the road as we get into it anyways. What we find about Gideon is, yes, Gideon looks like he is bold, looks like he has done some incredible things, but Gideon still has his own faults, and Gideon's still marching to the beat of his own drum at this point in time. He started being this timid, shy guy that God said, hey, I can use you if you'll just follow me. And eventually he looks and says in chapter 7, hey, we're going to go. God's going to give us this victory. They get this victory. And in the midst of this battle, he was completely changed to where he was not doing what God had asked him to do. He was not the person that the people needed him to be. Gideon was doing what was right in his own eyes. He may have turned down the role of the king, but he led the people in a horrible direction as an example to them. He did not lead them well. even though he said, I can't be your king. Let God rule over you. That was not the example that he gave them. If you're going to look and say, hey, God's going to be our leader, then you need to be the example of you following God. He did. He left God out of this. He started really shy with it and really relying on God, but once he got into it, he turned and left God out of this. This should have been an idea that, hey, we don't need an earthly king. But Israel's not, they don't learn that quickly. And so they continue on. Let's read the last 3 verses and we'll wrap up Judges chapter 8. It says, Then it came about, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the sons of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Now, if you're anything like me, you read all these different Baals and you're like, I don't know who Baal-berith is. Well, that is Baal of the covenant. That's what that name means. So in the midst of this, Gideon dies. They're still in a covenant with God. God's still taking care of them. And God has eventually just told them, hey, you're going to have to do something different. And so they forget what God has done. We're going to see that they forget what Gideon has done. And they start following a God a foreign God, this idol that is a God of the covenant. Irony everywhere in the midst of that because they're not covenantal people. They don't do a good job with following that. So it comes about, Gideon dies. They go right back to the same things they were doing. Verse 34, Thus the sons of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the household of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accord with all the good that he had done to Israel. Not only did they forget God, they forgot what Gideon had done. And they didn't even show any favor to his family. This is the same family that they looked and said, hey, you, your son, and your son's son, we want y'all to rule over us. But once Gideon died, they're like, nah, forget y'all. We're not worried about y'all. We're not even showing kindness. It's not even that they were just okay with being in the same room with them. They showed no kindness to him whatsoever. But some interesting things that you find here is that the same place that they worshipped this Baal-berith, we're told as you study in it, is in Shechem. Well, the same place that they worshipped in Shechem is ironically the same place that they renewed their covenant with God at the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua 24, where they made the commitment saying, we're not going to follow the gods of the land. In that same place is where they spend time worshiping a foreign god from the land. The nation of Israel has a lot of things going on. A lack of leadership, a lack of concern, a lack of a fear of God. There's just a lot that is happening in this, and it's not getting any better. God continues to allow them to have these judges to come and rule over them, to free them. But every time one of them is gone, they go right back into the cycle. They're running to what they know. Every time they run back to what is comfortable. They completely forget God again. They lived in this severe oppression, so much so that they weren't willing to share bread. But once they were free, they lived undisturbed in the land for 40 years. And in the span of 40 years, they forgot everything that was going on. They had already turned to another god. They were playing the harlot, as we're told, with this ephod that Gideon had put in his hometown. They're already worshiping other things before Gideon's ever gone. And then Gideon goes, and they're right back to where they were. That is the problem with us following man and not following God. Gideon should have set that example for the people. We should set that example for other people. That, hey, you can follow me as long as you know that I'm following God. And we'll follow God together. But I don't ever want you to think that what Josh says trumps what God says. I don't ever want you to think that, hey, I got to follow this man just because he's my pastor when he's clearly not doing the things that Scripture told us about in our forefathers. Gideon was not leading how God had showed they were supposed to lead, and yet they still followed him. They did that with all of the people that were set before them, and when you follow a man and that man is now gone, guess what? So is your faith. So is everything else, and you've got to reestablish everything that you thought you knew was right. I've told y'all before, there's a lot of people that have lost their lives following a man because he led them the wrong way. We've got to be vigilant. We've got to know God's word. We got to spend time in God's word. We got to spend time in prayer, discerning what it is that God is trying to teach us, because it is imperative that you follow God and not a person. Because at some point in time, that person is going to be gone, and you're going to be left looking, going, what are we supposed to do? That started all the way back with Joshua and the nation of Israel. They didn't know what to do because they'd been following a man for so long. When we follow God, we don't get near as confused. Because when we look and we can trust and say, hey, God's done this before, we can continue to follow him until he says, next man up. We can continue to follow him until he puts somebody in that role of leadership. We can continue to follow him until God takes care of the voids that we have. There's nothing else that we learn from the nation of Israel. We need to be reminded that what we've got to do is we've got to follow God. No matter what. No matter what it is. We follow God, and God's going to work some things out. He's going to do some incredible things in your life, in the life of his church, in the life of his people. No matter where God takes you, he will do incredible things if you are committing to following him and not just a person. Let's turn our attention